which I have never been able to transgress. Among people, I am like a new being. It has never been possible for me to connect with them completely. I have been far away from even those who have been my old friends. When I am so distant by nature, then naturally to be close just because of social norms is very strenuous for the mind. I feel compelled to be amidst them. The conflicts with people for the sake of life force are equally important. However, bracing the air of the higher reaches of creative solitude, frequent descents into the planes of everyday living are unavoidable. In the planes, it is the myriad social interactions, the warmth of companionship, the pleasures of friendship, and the deep satisfactions of intimacy in the family that give life much of its meaning. And as one ages and the creative fire burns less bright than it did in the fullness of youth, or even in the autumn of the middle years, the sojourns in the plains get longer and longer. It is now that life makes unfamiliar demands on those like Rabindranath, who never sufficiently developed the art of living in the intermediate space between loneliness and solitude, who missed out on the more muted palette of colors that lie between those expressing the anguish of the former and the exaltation of the latter. The old poet would seek to fill the vacuum left by the desertion of his muse by seeking company, but knew that this was not a solution for his malaise. In a letter to Rani Mahalanobis, a 40 years younger woman friend and a confidant of his old age, there is some of this regret when he writes, "I have remained alone in my load of work. This loneliness is not very pleasant for me, because that work which is for people is fundamentally against being alone. For that work, it is very necessary to be connected with people. But I did not have much of what could attract people to me. Yet the work which I am carrying along all those long years, my thoughts about it alone have kept pushing me ahead." There are intimations of a quiet despair as the aged poet seeks to reverse a lifelong yearning for solitude and enter the ordinary world of human commerce. But failing, again seeks to reconnect to his familiar life force, his imagination, his creativity. As Rabindranath aged, he became more and more aware of the key fingers of loneliness that would often grip his heart. What he would then pine for was simple human warmth, a feeling of being lovingly connected with another human being, even if the connection was not intellectually or otherwise stimulating. Enough for the loneliness part. All right. Now, Rabindranath's capacity for solitude, for knowing, appreciating, and joyfully accepting to be alone, an ability which some have held to be a sine qua non for one who would be a poet. A sense of the poet's solitude or of loneliness seeking to transform itself into the former is often our most dominant impression in reading poetry. So Rabindranath's solitude or loneliness, he turned into solitude in his gift of poetry, which, as I said, he started writing at the age of 8, which also started him getting some attention from others, from older people in the family. Rabindranath grasped at the identity of the poet that was offered him with all the strength of his slender arms. Now I'm talking about his boyhood, 8 to 9. Like the scaffolding that holds up a crumbling building, the poet identity was indispensable in shoring up a depleted and shaky sense of self-esteem, although the feeling of being worthless and unlovable never completely disappeared. In March 1893, writing to his niece Indra, with whom he could be quite honest, Rabindranath says, and I just quote him here, "Often I think that had it not been for my poetic strength or a few other natural talents, then there would be only a few like me in this world, so unbearable, fruitless. Even I am born worthless. But due to my capacity to write, I have somehow managed to get away with it in this lifetime. Otherwise, none of you would have been able to love me at all. That I know for sure. The fact that everyone loves Suri, his nephew, is not because of his work or power or any effort, but rather due to his inner integrity and beauty. Being born in this world, I have got you all as my relatives, and I remain forever grateful for that. Only I know how much all of you have helped me. Those who are good human beings would not know what value their love has. That you and Suri love me still amazes me, though I may even somewhat expect it. If I think deep enough, I feel that I do not deserve anything that is good at all. Everything has been granted with special permission. I have received so much and so easily that I may not often understand how unbelievably bountiful they are. In the next few years, I'm still talking of his childhood, Rabindranath assiduously cultivated the poet identity. For instance, while traveling with his father at the age of 12 to Bolpur, he tells us that ignoring the burning heat of the day and the hard, unturfed gravel, he wrote poetry. Quote him, "I love to do it sprawling under a young coconut palm. This seems to me the true manner, since it was not just writing poems, but holding a picture of myself as a poet before my imagination that was important to him." It was this identity of a poet that he would cling to in his darker hours throughout his life. Quote again, "I was born a poet. I am not an athlete. I do not belong to an arena. The stare of the curious crowd scorches my soul. Why should I be anything else but a poet? Was I not born a music maker?" He would sometimes plaintively state, and at others proudly assert. Rabindranath remained highly ambivalent towards all the other identities that were ascribed and offered to him in his adult years. Philosopher, educationist, man of letters, the wise man from the East, Gandhi's the great sentinel, and so on. To his friend Andrews, he would mock his different personas, refusing to acknowledge that they constituted and could ever compete with his fundamental identity as a poet. And I quote from a letter again, "And am I not a poet? What business have I to try and be anything else? But unfortunately, I'm like an inn, where the poet lodger has to accommodate strange bedfellows by his side. But is it not high time for me to retire from this none too lucrative business of innkeeper? Anyhow, I'm feeling tired, and my duty to my numerous lodgers is imminently in danger of being shamefully neglected." And at another place, after talking of the poet within, "Sometimes it amuses me to observe the struggle for supremacy that is going on between the different persons within me. Practical man, patriotic man, man who is good. As for me, who am the president of this panchayat, I have my deepest sentiment of tenderness for this poet, possibly because he is utterly good for nothing, and who is first to be ignored in the time of emergency. I simply jump up from my judgment seat and, holding the poet by the hand, dance a jig and sing, 'I shall join you, comrade, and be drunk and be gloriously useless.' Ah, my evil luck. I know why presidents of meetings hate me. Newspapers' editors revile me. The virile call me effeminate, and I try to take my shelter among children who have the gift of being glad with things and men that have no value." The poet was the child within, not the melancholic child of exile and loneliness, but the child of solitude and soaring imagination, transforming the hurts and defeats of the former into triumphs. On board the ship bound for India, he again writes to Andrews, "Dear friend, the very fact that we have turned our face towards the East fills my heart with joy. For me, the East is the poet's East, not that of a politician or a scholar. It is the East of magnanimous sky and exuberant sunlight, where once upon a time a boy found himself straying in the dim twilight of child consciousness peopled with dreams. The child has grown, but never grown out of his childness. I realize it all the more strongly when some problems, political or otherwise, become clamorous and insistent. trying to exact its answer from me. I rouse myself up, I strain my mind, I raise my voice for prophetic utterances, in every way try to be worthy of the occasion. But in my heart of heart, I feel exceedingly small, and to my utter dismay, I discover I'm not a leader, not a speaker, not a teacher, and furthest away from being a prophet. The fact becomes fully evident to me that I had forgotten to grow. Rabindranath's loneliness, solitude really ended with the deepest relationship, which was with the wife of his elder brother, Jyotindranath, when she came into the family, Kadambari. She was only 2 years older. She was at that time 12, he was 10. Kadambari was not only Ravi's intimate companion of his journey as a budding poet, but also a caretaker of his more prosaic corporeal needs. For a boy like Ravi, who had become resigned to the frugal and tasteless meals dished out by the servants, Kadambari's lovingly cooked dishes that replaced his earlier ruder fare were a gustatory revelation, as much a sign of her love as the serious attention with which she listened to his songs. Ailing and close to death, Rabindranath could still summon the taste of his favorite mashed chor-chori, mixed vegetables prepared with shrimp with a light flavoring of chilies, which Kadambari cooked especially for him. In the evenings, Ravi joined his brother Jyotindranath and Kadambari on the terrace that had been transformed by her into a garden with rows of tall palms along the balustrades, surrounded by sweet-smelling flowering shrubs, oleander, tuberose, chameli, champa. At the age of 80, Rabindranath's boyhood memories of those enchanted evenings are as sensual as they are precise. And I quote from the second autobiography, At the Age of 80, which he wrote. At the end of the day, mats and bolsters would be arranged on the terrace. On a silver dish, jasmine garlands wrapped in damp handkerchiefs would be placed. There would be a tumbler of iced water on a saucer and in a bowl, fragrant pan of the indigenous variety, freshly bathed and dressed, her hair coiffed. Bhuthakuron, that is Kadambari, would take her place. Jyotida would appear, a light wrap cast airily across his shoulders. He would put his bow to the violin, and I would launch into a song on a high note. The Creator has never taken away the slight talent for music he had granted me. Across the rooftop, my song would carry, and into the sunset sky. From the far-off sea, the southern breezes would blow, and the sky would fill with stars. Like the children, which the two adolescents also were, Ravi and Kadambari would often, sometimes bicker. It is unjust to keep squirrels in a cage, he would tell her. Stop acting like a schoolmaster, she would retort. Further remonstrances would follow after Ravi had surreptitiously released the two caged squirrels. Kadambari's fondness for fashionable clothes was occasion for repeated quarrels. Ravi wanted her to wear old-fashioned white, black-bordered saris rather than the fashionable dresses of silk and lace which she preferred. Ravi would express his distaste for such superficiality. She was better than that, after all. I quote from here, how deeply it upset me, I cannot describe. I would repeatedly object, in great agitation. At your age, no need to behave as if you are my uncle, would be her reply. I could never win a debate with Bhuthakuron, because she never counted my arguments. I also lost to her at chess, at which she was an expert. From Rabindranath's fond memories of their wranglings, such as the times when she was away visiting relatives, I would be enraged to find her sandals missing from their place outside her door and would hide some precious item from her room to force a quarrel. It is evident that the squabbles were both an expression of their intimacy and a less than conscious struggle to deny its increasing appropriation of their hearts. Kadambari's disparaging remarks, quote, Ravi is the darkest among the brothers and neither is he good looking. He has a peculiar voice and will never be a good singer. Sarya, the cousin, sings much better. He will never be able to write like Bihari Chakraborty. Our attempts at distancing herself from her attraction to him, keeping its dangerous consequences at bay. From his lifelong devotion to her memory, evoked in a number of his poems and songs, it is apparent that Robi justly registered Kadambri's taunts as teasing, her soulful eyes saying something quite different from her tart tongue. Some of Rabindranath's biographers have called Kadambri the deepest female influence on Rabindranath's youth, the playmate and guardian angel, deepest heartfelt realization in life. But perhaps what she meant to Rabindranath is best expressed in his own words, even when Kadambri is not their explicit addressee. And I quote him, "The heart of human beings is like liquid, which changes shape if the containers are different. Very rarely it finds the ideal container where it will not feel the emptiness or constriction." Kadambri was simply Robi's ideal container. As Robi's adolescence gives way to youth, there's a subtle change in the mood of the relationship. The first hint comes in Robi's memory of accompanying Jyotindranath and Kadambri to their garden estate, a small two-storied house on the banks of the Ganges. It has begun to rain, and Robi has just composed a tune to the poet Vidyapati's song. And I quote him here, "Enameled with melody, that cloudy day on the Ganges shore survives even now in the jewel casket of my rain songs. I remember the gusts of wind that assail the treetops every now and then, causing a great stirring and swaying among the branches, the dingies scudding along the river, their white sails tilting in the wind, the splash of tall, plunging waves upon the ghat. When she returned, I sang the song for her. She listened in silence, without uttering a word of praise. I was 16 or 17 then. We argued about the pettiest of things, but our exchanges had lost their sharpness. No longer children, the sexual current in their mutual attraction and the impossibility of its consummation had begun to breach the wall standing in the way of its conscious awareness." The relationship with Kadambri had rooted Robi, seduced him back into the world, quickened his psyche with the life force of Eros, given him great joy, and affirmed his destiny as a poet. And yet it inevitably came up against the reality that she belonged to another. In a letter to Rani Mahalnobis, written when he was almost 70, Rabindranath conflates the recollections of his late childhood and early youth into a single memory, which in a letter, which I'll just like to read a little. "Rani, I don't know why suddenly that day a childhood imagery awoke. Winter morning around 5:30.